So before beginning our last panel of this Melamu Symposium, I'd like to join my fellow participants and praise Professor Rahim Shaigan and Dr. Marissa Stevens for such a rewarding and productive Melamu Symposium. The bridging of geographical locations, time periods, and disciplines, these past 3 days have provided an important forum for the investigation of the ancient Near East. So for our last panel today, our presenters will discuss the religious landscape of the Sasanian world. Our first speakers, Matthew Canepa, is professor of art history and archaeology of ancient Iran at the University of California, Irvine. His research interest focuses on the intersection of art, ritual, and power in the Eastern Mediterranean, Persia, and the wider Iranian world. His most recent book, entitled The Iranian Expanse: Transforming Royal Identity Through Landscape Architecture and the Built Environment from 550 BCE to 642 CE, published with the University of California Press, recently, I believe in the last month, won the James Wiseman Award from the Archaeological Institute of America. Congratulations. Today, he gives a paper entitled Reevaluating Divine Imagery in Late Antique Iranian Metalwork.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that really kind introduction. And of course, thank you to Marissa for her capable management of this event, and my gratitude to Professor Shaigan for his kind invitation to participate in this important conference with this all-star cast, international cast. So I shall also probably say my apologies for subjecting you all to this gauntlet of ancient Iran this week and next week with our conference at the Jordan, but we would very much look forward to welcoming you there as well. So the majority of my work in the last 5 years or so has focused on the Achaemenid and Hellenistic period. So it's a pleasure to be invited by Rahim to present on a late antique topic for Melamu. So Sasanian precious metals represent one of the great artistic and political traditions of late antique Western Asia. Transmitted materially and reinterpreted conceptually, metalwork was one of the key mediums wherein Roman, Iranian, Indian, Turkic, and Chinese tastes commingled and competed over centuries. And it was rivaled only by textile ornament for its broad Eurasian appeal. A small corpus of such luxury vessels integrate what scholarship might identify as divine imagery descendant from the Mediterranean. Such vessels attest to a long and complicated history of interchange between the Iranian and Mediterranean worlds, and this paper seeks to understand and characterize the origins and possible significances of this peculiar type of luxury object in late antiquity. So here I examine several objects that I've worked on individually for the upcoming Getty exhibition, and use this as an opportunity to examine larger problems that emerge in dealing with them in aggregate. So to provide sort of a broader framework, Sasanian silver served two primary purposes within and eventually beyond the borders, the frontiers rather, of the Persian Empire. A special group of objects were specifically designed to bring the royal image before the eyes of the great and minor nobility in a medium that was intrinsically precious. The style and iconography and the elemental composition of their silver set them apart as a distinct and relatively coherent group. Such vessels were, in a sense, portable and distributable monuments, supplementing the static repertoire of the early rock reliefs and offering a variation of the themes known through literary sources and stucco fragments that graced palace interiors. Still more, as diplomatic gifts, they projected the power and glory of the king outwards to steadfast, wavering, or potential clients on the imperial frontiers, and even into the palace of the Sasanian king's Roman brother as the two sovereigns addressed each other in diplomatic protocol. In this, they served a purpose not unlike a Roman missorium and participated in a broader enmeshed late antique political material culture. A larger group of objects played a more practical, though certainly not prosaic role, as tableware for the bazm, that is, formal banquets that prominently featured ritualized consumption of wine. While many vessels were created for provincial gentry at their own tables, a small number of objects were gifted by the courts of high officials and even the King of Kings. They rendered a courtier socially and politically visible and powerful albeit in a partitive and, most importantly, contingent sense. Many late antique Sasanian silver vessels contained a distinctive repertoire of figural decoration, often including grapevines and idealized female figures dancing and holding what might be ritual objects. These images could reflect the pleasures offered by the Sasanian court to its elites in return for their fealty. It reminded them of this bond when they returned home to their domains. Let us now turn to the problem of divine iconographies. And here, I initially had set up a more of a historical context, but since we have very excellent and capable colleagues, I can reduce a little bit of this. The Seleucids play a role in the formation of Iranian culture that's both pivotal and, from the point of view of the Iranian historiographical and epic tradition, completely disavowed. While the reviled evil Alexander is at least acknowledged, the Seleucids are completely cut out of the tradition in the Book of Kings. Yet a cursory series of some of the basic features of Parthian and Sasanian kingship show their preeminence and their impact. When we do, for example, have the appearance of a uniform and imperially planted sacred architecture, it comes from the Seleucid period for temples. Taken together with the Syrian evidence, the temples from Aichnum and Takhti Sangin subverted many of the field's paradigms of Hellenistic colonization and cultural identity. Early interpreters sought the origins of these temples in a yet-to-be-discovered Achaemenid fire temple or otherwise undetectable Babylonian ethnicity, circularly imputed to the settlement's citizens or the temple's gods. But the evidence that we have indicates that these features coalesced and were implanted by the Seleucid Empire. Turning to divine iconographies, we see a similar abrupt rupture with the coming of the Seleucids and subsequent adaptation under the Parthians. The Seleucid period ushered in a new visual system for conceptualizing and communicating ideas of divine power. Greek iconographies, such as that of Heracles, were adopted by the court and became incredibly popular throughout all echelons of society. As Rolf clearly and effectively emphasized, these were deliberately left open for interpretation in the Seleucid period. I would add that the Arsacids also appropriated this technique, and they continued to serve as images unifying multiple constituencies of the Parthian Empire, be they Iranian, Greek, or otherwise. We see this in female deities as well, such as Tyche and Aphrodite. As attested by the inscriptions on the Heracles from Messene, which identify the figure as Heracles in Greek and Vertragen in Parthian, these were communicated visually across multiple cultural idioms. In effect, the Greek iconographies could be described as iconographic ideograms, for those of you who have labored with Pahlavi. Those signifiers that were perforce promiscuous and continually drawing from a web of signification that extended from the Mediterranean even as they reached out for new identities, from Bahram in Iran to Nergal in Syria to Vajrapani in Buddhist South Asia. And the Parthians did not passively use these iconographies, did not use them passively, but creatively reinterpreted and reconfigured them to fit Iranian ideas. For example, the bearded Tyche on the reverse of the coin of Phraates II, perhaps fusing the female goddess of fortune with the Iranian Huarana, which was linguistically and conceptually male. By the early Sasanian period, however, these Greek iconographic traditions largely faded, and a new Zoroastrian divine iconography appears vividly in Sasanian official art. Most notably, we see the first fully anthropomorphic image of Ormazd and Ahriman, too, for that matter. And just as a kind of slight sidebar, this is Ahura Mazda. In my opinion, I don't think there's any controversy anymore. He appears over and over and over again in the royal inscriptions. The other interpretations, the Fravashis, etc., don't appear once. And of course, the royal inscriptions are echoed in the composition and iconography of the Bisitun inscription as well. But this is the first time now Ormazd has legs in the same way. The return of Greco-Roman iconography reappears in the Sasanian period, but in a different context, and I will argue for a different purpose. With Shapur's successful raids into the Roman East, Roman craftsmanship appears as an ornament to his reign in his monumental art and architecture. At the same time, we see a new fluorescence of classical divine imagery concentrated in a different medium, primarily luxury silver vessels. So for an encyclopedic view of Iranian divine iconography writ large, I can luckily refer to you to Michael Shankar's authoritative work, Intangible Spirits and Graven Images. Here, I'll primarily focus on this more narrow medium and narrow phenomenon. First, some of the better-known works. This plate came to the British Museum from Afghanistan in the 19th century. Said to originate from Badakhshan, it presents a reinterpretation of a late Hellenistic compositional tradition of the triumph of Dionysus. Dionysian elements and viticulture scenes have a long presence in the arts of post-Hellenistic Asia after Alexander. And within the arts of Bactria and Gandhara, Dionysian themes appear in great abundance in a variety of media. At its center, a large male figure reclines holding a drinking bowl, aloft in his right hand. A small female figure perches by the central figure's left elbow, and a striding male figure holding the club and lion skin of Heracles dances to the right. Two female figures walk in front of the reclining figure with their forearms drawn up to their chest. If the viewer is familiar with the iconographic repertoire of the triumph of Dionysus and Ariadne, the rectangle on which the central figure sits and the rayed circle floating below are identifiable as components of the god's cart or chariot. Now, regional comparanda are not lacking. Out of several possible examples, here I'm showing a relief from a stupa stair riser in the British Museum, portraying a procession with revelers drawn in a cart that suggests the Dionysian processions were already part of the repertoire of the arts of Hellenistic and post-Hellenistic Asia. However, this plate exhibits the greatest affinity with an object from 1st century BC Mediterranean. That is a late Hellenistic cameo in Naples, providing us with an idea of the type of portable object that could have been its precursor. This suggests that this specific composition not only reflects new currents coming from the Mediterranean, but one that could have moved from one medium to the other. Indicative of the process, the shape and method of manufacture of the plates clearly connect it to Sasanian metalwork instead of earlier Parthian or Greco-Bactrian traditions. It creates this relief effect with multiple pieces attached to the plate mechanically, as commonly appears in the early Sasanian royal plates, with grooves noticeable when pieces fell off or removed. Also similar to these, the Dionysian plate uses mercury amalgam gilding instead of earlier Hellenistic and Parthian techniques of diffusion gilding, where gold foil was atomically bonded to the silver through mechanical pressure and heating. Reflecting this late antique provenance, the plate juxtaposes two separate sculptural modes of representation. Some of these, including the treatment of the drapery, the wings and the wheel, match the more stylized features of late antique metalwork. Others, including the heads and bodies of the human and animal figures, seems to make an effort to adapt and adhere to the sculptural forms of the artisan's late Hellenistic or early Roman templates. Many elements tethering it to its original composition have been lost, however. The two female figures have lost their wings and are no longer connected to the chariot. Other, like the figure of Heracles and the flying Erotes, have appeared. So it is likely that this plate was not the origin of this motif into late antique metalwork, but reflects a stage along a creative process already in full career. Once integrated into the late antique Iranian repertoire, the composition took on a life of its own. Representing a later development of the composition and this process, a plate in the National Museum of Asian Art presents a composition that is recognizable as related to the New York Metropolitan plate, but is departed even further from its original Dionysian precursor. The women, once drawing the cart, have become dancers. The cart itself completely deconstructed to a carpet and decorative floating circular motif, and the central male figure has become female and holds a bowl of food instead of wine. And Heracles, the only figure who retains his classical iconography, now sports a mustache, bracelet, and Koloff-style headgear, evoking the fashions of the Sasanian elite. A profusion of grapevines and wine-drinking vessels among the minor figures suggests that an association with wine and feasting remained constant. Many Sasanian wine-drinking vessels also integrate subsidiary iconographic and ornamental features that could be traced to a Dionysian origin. These include the characteristic teardrop ewers of the Sasanian bazm that include idealized female figures. Despite the fact that many of the attributes, such as birds, implements, or vegetal elements, are broadly similar across these and other vessels, the imagery does not reflect a rigidly set iconographic system, and its exact meaning is still elusive. Past scholarship put forth a variety of reinterpretations of the figures, largely without evidence. These included interpreting them as the Iranian goddess of the waters, Anahid, who in rock reliefs and seals is invariably dressed modestly in royal garb, some sort of fallacious Anahid priestess, or queens. And these images run contrary to all known portrayals of both Anahid and Sasanian royal women in official art. The distant precursors of the Sasanian imagery owe a clear debt to the Greco-Roman iconographic repertoire of Dionysian maenads. Some subsidiary elements include panthers being fed from ewers, similar to the objects themselves. Precursors have also been sought in late Roman portrayals of the horae, that is, the seasons, though they differ markedly from these antecedents as well. So again, we're not dealing so much with a pure and unadulterated Dionysian iconographic tradition, as some have argued, but rather something that is selectively integrating these features for a different purpose. And I want to stress here that the inscriptions point to their ultimate context, that is, of the system of extraction and redistribution of the Sasanian court, rather than any specifically religious context. In this regard, the weight of the evidence suggests that the goal of these ewers was not to faithfully replicate a complicated religious iconography, but impart a sense of gravity by emulating some of its conventions. Ultimately, these vessels simply celebrated the pleasures of the bazm. At least that's my working hypothesis. So turning to things that haven't quite been discussed as much, this plate presents an image without close parallels in the late antique Iranian world. And the origins and meanings of all of its iconographies has not been fully explored. So here we have a nude female figure standing in the center of the plate, clutching a long cloak with her raised left hand, which drapes over her right shoulder. Lines of circular punch marks imbue the cloak with a sense of ornamental richness, and a seven-pointed tiara rises over the crown of her head, and a bejeweled diadem encircles her brow, while her curling locks flow over her shoulders. She wears rich jewelry, including anklets, bracelets, and 2 necklaces, the longer of which hangs in a circular ornament rendered in relief. Her nipples, pudenda, and pubic hair are rendered with tooling, leaving no doubt that she was intended to be portrayed nude. And 2 winged boys hold a billowing veil overhead, while 2 more place their hands on her feet in an act of reverence. She holds a small object with 3 termini. The middle is ovoid and ends in a point, while the outer 2 are circular. And 2 identically dressed and symmetrically posed female figures stride towards the central figure. The attendant on the left holds aloft a cup with her left hand while cradling a bird in her right, and the counterpart holds a small vessel suspended by a chain and a bird in her left hand. Past scholarship has often erred in associating every female figure with the goddess Anahid, including the semi-nude dancers on Sasanian ewers, vases, and wine bowls. And as pointed out by Michael Shankar, this goddess invariably appears modestly dressed in royal raiment across the Iranian world. This is the case in Sasanian numismatic representations on the coins of Hormizd and Vahram II, the Sasanian Kushan Shahs, Ardakhshir I and II, and Hormizd II, as well as the rock reliefs of Narsi at Naqshi Rustam and Khosrow II at Taki Bustan, as well as in Panjikent as well. In post-Achaemenid Anatolia, the goddess was identified with Artemis, not Aphrodite, and is portrayed fully clothed with long flowing robes. The description of the iconography of the goddess preserved in the Avesta again presents her as fully clothed. And this is drawn from Michael Shankar's work, and he points out that while the Avesta would not have been relevant primarily, would only been relevant in a priestly context in the Sasanian period, it's also noteworthy that she's never portrayed as a goddess of sexual pleasure in it, which holds true for the Middle Persian priestly books as well. The closest parallels are found in Roman portrayals of Venus and Aphrodite, where the goddess remains popular even after the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and appears in a wide variety of statuettes and domestic objects, including cosmetic cases, hairpins, and caskets. The pose of the female figure recalls representations of the goddess with her right arm upraised and left arm at her shoulder, as in the tradition of Apelles' Aphrodite Anadomine, and the prominence of the jewelry evokes the tradition of Praxiteles' Aphrodite Psyllamune. The goddess appears in similar poses in bronze and silver statuettes found throughout the Roman world, including a statuette in the Getty's collection, and toiletry articles as like a 5th century and 6th century circular ivory pyxis in the Walters Art Museum. More proximate in terms of medium, a late Roman silver plate dated to the 6th century in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France shares several iconographic features with the Sasanian plate, though many details diverge. The plate is slightly larger at 29 centimeters and portrays Venus and Adonis. The goddess displays her rich jewelry prominently and wears a long necklace that similarly terminates in a circular ornament, although rendered differently than that of the Sasanian plate, where it protrudes as a circular relief. She holds herself in a slightly different pose, with her head inclined to the left towards the male figure, and her stole drapes around her hips. Nevertheless, like the Sasanian plate, she holds the stole in her left hand and a tripartite object, stole in her left and a tripartite object in her right. The two attendants are similar to the female figures on Sasanian ewers and bear comparable articles. Their dress is broadly similar to Sasanian vessels, and the billowing cloaks framing their heads and brooches at their shoulders suggest the influence of a Roman model. The Sasanian plate bears an inscription and joins several other Middle Iranian inscriptions that state that the object was given as a reward, a mizd, hinting at the shared cultures of gifting and silver plate that extended across the Mediterranean through Western Asia. The plate with the Adonis and Venus here was found in context with the Mausoleum of Gelimer, which bears a Latin inscription identifying the donor as the Rex of the Vandals in Alani. So, like many Roman compositional or iconographic motifs in Sasanian art, this plate has freely adapted the Roman model. The attendants are similar, but not exactly represented. And here, just as I mentioned it, here's the inscription itself, which has no representation, no mention of any sort of divine identity or significance. It's indistinguishable from the other royal inscriptions that we encounter in a variety of different royal gifts. Now, there's a number of other objects which we might compare to provide additional context, such as this plate in Switzerland, which integrates the iconography of the capture of the Erymanthian boar and integrates it into a characteristically Sasanian medium and object type, the plate. And like the previous object, this plate contains compositional and iconographic elements that evoke common classical iconographies while creatively modifying them, or in the case of this plate, even recombining them with other classical or Persian iconographic motifs. So here we can trace this, or at least it can evoke the iconography of the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux. But unlike traditional Greco-Roman representations, the horses are winged, conflating the Dioscuri with representations of Bellerophon and Pegasus. Unusual for Sasanian art, the twins retain their heroic nudity and are portrayed clean-shaven with short curly hair, adhering closer to classical models than contemporary Persian styles. Two additional figures have been added: the torso of a fully clothed female figure whose head is encircled with a diadem, and this emerges from the stylized palmettes or acanthus leaves at the bottom of the plate. The horses both incline their heads towards the overflowing water vessel she supports, and this might be traced visually to a personification of the spring of Pyrene, where Bellerophon captured Pegasus. Like the rest of the plate's iconography, however, it's unlikely that the figures retained their classical mythological identities. Winged horses appear by themselves in Persian textiles and seals and may have symbolized the royal fortune, though combined with the twins in this context, it's more likely this image was understood to portray the constellation Do Bahikar, that is Gemini. A Sasanian plate, also in the Sackler Gallery, portrays two winged horses, but without the twins, and could be related, though in a later process of mixing and further elaborating. With parallels to be found in Persian banqueting scenes rather than the classical visual tradition, a small male musician sits cross-legged between the twins. So in conclusion, the theomorphic imagery on the plates, while idiosyncratic, does not occur in isolation, but was consumed by elites who participated in the visual cultures of the Persian Empire with a long independent tradition of Asian Hellenism. In both Iran and South Asia, deep-seated traditions of Hellenism cultivated by communities descendant from the Seleucid and post-Seleucid Hellenistic kingdoms were reinvigorated with new elements coming from the West. Under the Parthian and Kushan empires, a brisk trade in luxury objects and even movement of craftsmen periodically brought new objects, images, and ideas from the Hellenistic and Roman East. At least this is the model that we get if we interpret it in a sort of diffusionary model. I think what we have going on in the Sasanian world is something quite a bit different. They reflect the integration and reinterpretation of a classical mythological motif into a visual culture that still appreciated Mediterranean imagery, but now was created by artisans or for an audience who no longer necessarily interpreted them strictly through the lens of classical paideia, but, and I guess this is probably the most important point, as reflections of a cosmopolitan Iranian aristocratic culture animated by royal gifting and the bazm. Thank you.